everybody all at once. This is Theo Cedar Jones with part 5 of You Sleeping Fans of Rock, the death, decline, destruction, and resurrection of rock and roll music. And now I'm going to give you what I call the death of art timeline. This is basically the highlights or lowlights of the very worst things that have happened in rock music, which is the CIA's campaign of assassination against the best and the brightest of rock and roll and fine art. And I'm not going to try to convince you that all the deaths of these rock stars is directly or indirectly attributable to the deep state or the globalists, the CIA, or dirty tricks by whatever force or entity in the world. I'm just going to try to connect the dots. Like, if you did assume that all these deaths were foul play and that they were part of a conspiracy to literally do what the CIA does best, which is to destroy the morale and the integrity of any movement that they find to be unacceptable or intolerable. So I believe rock and roll was targeted by the CIA and the deep state. And if you take that as a given, and I'm not really trying to defend that point in all of this, I'm just saying, look at the effects. Look at the condition of rock today and ask yourself, well, isn't that exactly how it would turn out if it was the object of dirty tricks by the deep state for 5 decades? So right at the very beginning of rock and roll, there's foul play, and this begins with Buddy Holly and the Crickets. In my understanding, the first example of a rock band was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and the release of That'll Be the Day in 1957. And that's when Buddy Holly really had a band and was writing his own material. And this was the first example of a true rock band that has self-contained authorship and is playing electronic instruments and amplifiers. I don't believe there was a true rock band configuration before Buddy Holly and the Crickets, and Buddy Holly and the Crickets was what the Beatles based their band on, and the Beatles are the quintessential rock band and the first rock band of the second wave of rock music. But the reason there was a second wave is because the first wave was decimated. So Chuck Berry was busted for the Mann Act, or trying to take an underage person across state lines. But Buddy Holly was, the story is he died in a plane crash while trying to go on tour in the middle of wintertime in the Midwest. Now you might ask yourself, why would Buddy Holly have subjected himself to such dangerous conditions? I mean, touring was in a very early stage in rock and roll. I mean, this is probably one of the first true rock tours was Buddy Holly and the Crickets, since they were the first true rock band. The reason Buddy Holly was touring in such horrible conditions was because he and his wife were poverty-stricken, and they were living in New York. And he felt compelled to do whatever he could to make money, even if that meant traveling in a small airplane in the middle of a snowstorm. So Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens and the Big Bopper all died in that plane crash in 1959. So Buddy Holly only got 2 years of effective cultural productivity. And I don't really have a theory or inside information as to whether he really was assassinated. But let's just say that rock and roll was such a toxic environment for the artist that it was very easy for even America's golden child, Buddy Holly, who at the time was really the very peak of artistic genius in America, because art culminated in the rock band, and Buddy Holly was the first. So his songs and his icon that he created and the beauty of his energy were revolutionary and created a template that resounded throughout Western culture, namely the rock band. Why would America put its golden artist in a position of such desperation and poverty, freezing and starving in New York City in the middle of wintertime, so that he felt compelled and almost forced to go out and risk his life to make a buck? That's just an indication of things to come. This is how America treats its best and brightest. It either assassinates them outright, which I believe most of the rest of these cases are outright assassination. I don't know that in the case of Buddy Holly. But it's awfully suspicious to not only kill Buddy Holly, but Ritchie Valens too. Because Ritchie Valens wrote at least 2 amazing songs. And he did it before the age of 20. And he did it as a young Latino. So imagine the effect on youth culture if Ritchie Valens had lived and kept writing good songs and kept demonstrating that, yes, you brown-skinned kids can also have rock bands. It might have inspired dozens or hundreds of Latino rock bands to be formed. But that whole cultural thing was cut off, and I'm not sure that Santana, for whatever reason, ever really mentored or cultivated a lot of Latin rock bands in his wake. So it is a really major loss to have Ritchie Valens die. It's not just an incidental footnote to Buddy Holly's death. It's significant. It's really a big deal. And if you were the cabal and you really wanted to kind of take out the best and the brightest of the first wave of rock and roll, well, yeah, you would kill Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens. Because Bill Haley, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley were already taken care of through other ways. And I'll get to that. I don't know about Bill Haley, but for whatever reason, Bill Haley did not turn out to be a true rock band as such, and did not create the legacy that Buddy Holly did. And the Beatles didn't name themselves after the Bill Haley in the comments. The Beatles named themselves after Buddy Holly and the Crickets. So that's why I make that distinction, that Buddy Holly is the progenitor of the rock band as such. So basically 1957 is the beginning of the rock band as a technology and culture. That's when Buddy Holly got his recordings first established in the marketplace. So 57, let's use that as the beginning of our death of art timeline. 1957. Of course, you've also got Elvis Presley at this point already making his mark. So, what do you do to Elvis? Well, you put him in the army first, subject him to mind control, and then you make sure that during the most heated part of the 60s, you keep Elvis culturally in the deep freeze by forcing him to do a bunch of meaningless Hollywood movies. So that when Dylan and the Beatles are part of the raging psychedelic expansion of the 60s, Elvis was out of touch. He was literally kept out of the loop of his contemporaries by Tom Parker, his manager, Colonel Parker, who filtered what songs and what artists could gain access to Elvis. But basically, first Elvis was culturally neutered by putting him in the army and forcing him to do these Hollywood films which are meaningless at the heart of the 60s, when he could have been collaborating with John Lennon and George Harrison, which in my mind, that would have happened. Elvis was a truly great artist and a truly great performer, and he was truly loved by other artists and performers like the Beatles. And I think there would have been a grand convergence in rock and roll if Elvis and the Beatles had been able to come together and cooperate, and if point number 3 hadn't happened, which is the death of Paul McCartney in 1966. So obviously this is conspiracy, this is controversial, but nevertheless, I have come to the conclusion that Paul McCartney died in 1966 explains so much. It makes complete sense with all of the data and information that I can find. And no other explanation fits as well for the very bizarre transition that the Beatles went through from 1966 to 1967, where, as one commentator so brilliantly put it, that brightness and happiness and joy and ecstasy of combining Paul McCartney's voice with John Lennon's voice suddenly was gone. That happy harmonization of voices never happened in 67 or after. They still did beautiful harmonies on their albums, but never again did they combine their vocals on a co-authored song like I Want to Hold Your Hand. That incredible release of happiness. That was crushed because the stand-in for Paul McCartney, as brilliant as he was never a good close friend of John Lennon. They never had good chemistry vocally or as people or as artists. And so you notice they never collaborated again. There was all this tension between McCartney and Lennon all of a sudden in 1967. John Lennon's already trying to get out of the Beatles by 1967. He's already trying to get with Yoko and get away from something horrible, seemingly, that makes him just want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And that's so strange, because just a year before they were combining their voices in the most happy, ecstatic vocal union the world has ever seen. There's never been a release of energy like the vocals of John Lennon and Paul McCartney combined. And George too. George is right in there with that buzz, but he couldn't do it. George's voice couldn't combine with Lennon's after McCartney's death. There just wasn't the chemistry. And of course, you just tore the heart out of the Beatles by killing Paul McCartney. So, the Tavistock Institute, MI6, the CIA, they would have colluded in the death of Paul McCartney, in my opinion. And it would have made perfect sense that they absolutely, after the Beatles had said that they are bigger than Jesus, and after they had proven that they could summon or conjure like mass social ecstasy on an unlimited scale, they had to be taken out. They had to be taken out by the deep state. So things are not looking good in rock and roll already. It's like you can't even get 2 or 3 years of truth speaking by Buddy Holly or Paul McCartney before they're taken out. So if what I'm saying is true so far, imagine how chilling that is for artists, especially the ones in the know at the top of the industry. It's like there's a chilling sense that, if you stick your head above the ramparts and speak truth in rock, you'll end up like Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and Paul McCartney and Elvis have so far. And we're only up to 1966. Let's go to 1968. Valerie Solanas, self-proclaimed feminist, wrote the Scum Manifesto, the Society for Cutting Up Men. So this sort of virulent, sociopathic form of feminism reared its ugly head, and for some reason chose America's most important fine artist as her target. Isn't that a strange coincidence that some mind-controlled freak would target Andy Warhol? Now, you could basically say that when Andy Warhol got shot in 1968, that was effectively the end of America's predominance in fine art and painting. And I know this is a side note to rock and roll, but it is significant because they're symptoms of the same general movement of the deep state to demoralize and disconnect the masses from their culture through dirty tricks and assassination and taking out the leaders of culture. And Andy Warhol was the leader of culture when it came to fine art in America and the world. Andy Warhol was the biggest artist after Picasso, and he was American. And America had always been second fiddle to Europe when it came to fine art and painting until American abstract expressionism in the 50s and Andy Warhol in the 60s. But all that was frittered away because postmodernism killed abstract expressionism in America, and Valery Solanas took the spirit and the wind out of Andy Warhol's movement. Andy Warhol, of course, was a lot more scared after he got shot and nearly killed by Valery Solanas in 1968. And you kind of notice his work starts to get more and more safe and serving of the elites. He's doing a lot of kind of hackneyed portraits in the 80s of the rich and famous and being very safe. And then doing his best work at the end of his life, these monumental religious paintings, which never got famous. So his best work was the work that people saw the least, and his work that was seen the most was his most crass, vulgar pandering to the elites that he did not want to run afoul of. He wanted to keep what was left of his body after Valery Solanas. You know, if you've seen the just look up the scars on Andy Warhol's torso after he got out of surgery from being shot. I mean, those are just wicked, vicious-looking scars on his body. And he almost died from that. So, 1968, boom! The death of fine art in America. Then what's next? Well, 1970 is a watershed for the cabal. They really just took out a bunch of the leaders of culture. So, Jimi Hendrix died in 1970. He was being brutally raped and exploited economically, financially by his management. Died under suspicious circumstances. Janis Joplin, who was separated as a star from her band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and never made songs as good afterwards, and seemed to be vulnerable to that kind of Illuminati exploitation and abuse. She died in 1970 under, I believe, suspicious circumstances. And then Jim Morrison is harassed by the police for exposing his penis during a rock performance, and essentially run out of the country based on obscenity charges because he is doing his job as a shamanic, Bacchalic, Dionysian incarnation of Pan and exposing his genitalia, which is entirely appropriate and exactly what this fake cabal deserves. But he was driven out of the United States and died under mysterious circumstances in France. So, Jimi Hendrix dead, killed. Janis Joplin dead, killed. Jim Morrison dead, killed. You have just taken out 3. And then suddenly, Jefferson Starship turns to Jefferson Airplane turns to Jefferson Starship, turns to Starship. So the most radical hippie band with the most positive love message, they're taken out not through the killing of, say, Grace Slick, but through whatever means forcing them to change their message and their entire sound and make them essentially renounce their hippie rock roots and become some kind of faceless 80s copycat crap band. So that's another way to take out leadership. Because the Jefferson Airplane rather, is one of the most epitome hippie lyrics, love message, consciousness message, cooperation message, community message that you will ever find. On Surrealistic Pillow, that's about as loving as rock and roll was ever allowed to be. That is the sweetest, tenderest love rock album. And literally that was just decimated. That sentiment was rendered inoperable in culture. No, you can't sing about open-hearted community love. You can't sing about psychedelic experience. You can't sing about God. This is being ground out of the popular discourse in rock and roll. It's just being like crushed under the unique form of postmodernism that was suffocating the rock and roll industry, which is really just straight up hate God, hail Satan type of dark, low vibratory kind of creepiness. So here we are in 1970. You've just taken out Paul McCartney, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and Elvis. And what do you give as a substitute? So you take out the real leadership, but you can't just leave a power vacuum at rock and roll. You have to exalt and elevate and put on the permanent A-list status certain phonies and pretenders, like the Rolling Stones, who are very openly satanic and just plain dark, never had an ounce of love in their music. Bob Dylan, who out and out told you, it ain't me, babe. Oh, no, no, no. I'm not the man you're looking for, because he sold out to the Illuminati. He sold out the people. He sold out rock and roll. He is the biggest sellout until U2 and Bono. So the biggest sellouts in rock are Bono, U2, and Bob Dylan, because they represented the highest idealism within rock, other than John Lennon, who did not sell out. But of those that were carrying the flame and the torch of rock's highest ideals, we were sold a bill of goods with Bob Dylan and U2. They're supposed to be the best that rock can do, you know? It's supposed to be what we are aspirational towards, both rock and roll-wise, culturally-wise. But they were hired by the cabal to seduce all the hippies and the rockers and the bleeding hearts to believe that, oh, Bob Dylan, oh man, he's so deep, he's such a fucking profound prophet, man. He's like prophetic, deep. He's a fucking lying sack of shit. And then what else you do? You have to introduce fake, phony substitutes for the real thing. So Black Sabbath, unaccountably, as its career shortened, and you have to separate the star from the band. Ozzy suddenly has a solo career. They wrote War Pigs. They wrote the greatest anti-war song ever in history of rock, and they wrote some of the best lyrics and the most meaningful, significantly true, Electric Funeral. They're talking about nuclear war. They're talking about the most deep, real issues of good versus evil, about the fact of Satan and God. And they had to be taken out. Black Sabbath could not be tolerated. And what do we get as a substitute? AC/DC. So you take out Black Sabbath and that sort of truth-telling within rock, and you bring in a completely vetted, acceptable, fake substitute for the cabal's, delectation, where they're openly satanic, completely low vibratory, materialistic, just this low vibe of like, yeah, hey kids, hey teens, you can get into this like low, greedy vibration around sexuality, and you could just have the lowest, unloving regard for women and just be into fucking and sex and your rock and roll triumphalism, and it's all for the ego, and there's no love in AC/DC, and there's no truth, and there's no wisdom. It's the kind of rebellion that has been perfectly pre-digested, sanitized, and pre-approved by the cabal for youth. And so you got to get rid of Black Sabbath and put in AC/DC. Then you got to get rid of the Beatles and put in the Eagles. The Eagles are America's best attempt to create a commercial juggernaut substitute with sweet California harmonies And the Eagles enjoyed that permanent A-list status. And of course, Don Henley, what did you do to those underage people with drugs, dude? You know, but that's not even the worst of it. These permanent A-listers, the Eagles, were writing lyrics in Hotel California where they said, we haven't had that spirit here since 1969, i.e., we haven't had God or Christ in rock music since 1969 when the Church of Satan was established in San Francisco. And these West Coast fake liberal rockers, Eagles, Linda Ronstadt, were allied with the Democratic Party in the state of California and Jerry Brown. So that collusion of ultimate evil, the leftist Democratic Party in the state of California, the Eagles, an Illuminati-approved cultural rock band phenomenon that is completely loveless. Except for maybe that one song, I Can't Tell You Why. But again, why can't you tell me why? Is it because you're a pedophile and you got to stay secret about your real love? I can't tell you why, because I am doing illegal things. Yes, you fucking Eagle ripoff, traitorous scum. And I love Joe Walsh. I think he's a genius. I think their songs are great. But talent is no predictor of decency, my friends. And the Eagles were hired to put a hit on your heart and to make truth unacceptable within rock. And then what else do you get? Well, they killed off Real Disco, which was based on, again, real bands playing live instruments in a real, rock and roll type of format, and replaced it with electronic dance music and Madonna. And Madonna also is probably secretly transgendered, definitely completely satanic at this point. I mean, she is the whore of Babylon, epitomized, as is Beyonce, and Katy Perry, and you could name a bunch of other women who have sold out to the devil so hard in pop music and rock that you just, you'd need to be able to vomit from 10,000 mouths to express the degree of toxic horror that our culture has descended into with the most fake, satanic, plastic rock and roll pop music that you could ever conceive of. And it just gets more degraded each year. And this is a result of the death of art timeline. This is what you get when you take out the real leaders and you replace them with fake leaders. So it's not looking good in the 70s. And then you get a rare breath of fresh air with the Sex Pistols in 1977. But then what do you do about that truth and rock situation? Again, you break up the band. The Sex Pistols got one studio album and that was it. All she wrote. They did one tour in the southern United States. Whose idea was it to make the Sex Pistols tour in the South? I mean, shouldn't you go for the low-hanging fruit first and coddle this band that's such a rare and extraordinary truth teller? Great music too. And then Bob Marley. He's coming up in 1977 to 1984 at the same time as the Sex Pistols. He gets to have a few more years of effective truth-telling within rock. But then what do they do to Bob? Dirty tricks from the CIA. They put a cancer needle in his shoe, and it stabs him in his big toe. He gets sudden onset rapid cancer in his toe. Not from a soccer accident. They tried to shoot him earlier, and they succeeded, and he was wounded by gunshots. Bob was on the short list to be taken out. There was just his time was numbered, his days were numbered. God bless you, Bob. I love you every single day, and getting your inspiration every day. But when you talk about taking out leadership, he was like the Martin Luther King of rock music. I mean, he was the most popular human being. More so than the Beatles or any Michael Jackson or anybody who ever was at his peak. more humans on Earth knew about Bob Marley and revered him. So clearly, Bob Marley had the power to get opposing political factions in Jamaica to shake hands in the public forum. He had the power to make statesmen move to his command. He had the power to make millions or billions of human beings move to his command. Bob Marley was a kind of beautiful power, beautiful divine masculinity. I'm not saying he's a perfect man. I'm just saying he was a beacon of truth within rock, and you can just sense how badly the cabal would want to take him out. And so it goes in 1984. And I'm sorry, I skipped over the death of John Lennon in 1980. So really, from 1977 to 1984, George Orwell's 1984, that's a very historic and meaningful year. You could even use 1984 as the effective end of truth-telling in rock. And it came from this litany of destroy the Sex Pistols after 1977, kill John Lennon in 1980, kill Bob Marley in 1984. So in that 7-year generational period up to 1984, that's the key, strategic toppling of the leadership in rock music. And again, there's a power vacuum, so you have to introduce these phony substitutes. So heavy metal has always been the most radical force in music. You've got to replace it with fake substitutes. So we got rid of Black Sabbath. We eventually got rid of Led Zeppelin by 1980. Again, Led Zeppelin is out of the world stage by 1980. And then you have to give us Van Halen. And Van Halen, the lyrics in Van Halen show an actual marked decline. You start to see the Illuminati really getting its hooks in to the messaging of rock music, because you get things like Hot for Teacher where the protagonist never gets laid. It's like a Beavis and Butthead thing of you're glorifying the loser. It's a teenager who can't even go through the trials and rites of passage to achieve some kind of heroic outcome. It's amazing how pathetic and ineffectual and unlaid the characters in Van Halen are. And they're getting you ready for that sort of Homer Simpson, Bill Cosby type character where the male becomes impotent, where the male becomes castrated, emasculated, ineffectual, soft, exploitable, subordinate to women. All this kind of stuff is right there in Van Halen, and millions of young men are getting indoctrinated by this Van Halen shit. Even though, yes, Eddie Van Halen is like the best musician since Mozart. I mean, he's again, talent is no predictor of decency. There's such a gross, low vibration hovering over Van Halen. There's no love in that band. Running with the Devil. What kind of message is that? Running with the devil? That's that same AC/DC message of let's go to hell. Let's be with the devil. That's the best we've got as aspiration. I hate it. I've always hated that shit. I just am you're trying to glorify, glamorize, and romanticize the stupidest, shitty ideas. God damn. Okay, kids, we're in 1984, and it's now this is the death of art is in just nosedive. You've taken out the leadership, and now everybody knows in their subconscious that they don't dare speak truth in rock anymore. They don't dare say, I love God or Jesus in rock. They don't dare. And what do we get as a substitute? After the end of Queen, the end of the Police, the death of John Lennon, and the death of Bob Marley. What is our consolation prize? What is our aspirational band that is going to take rock and roll and the flame and the meaning and the significance and the ultimate purpose of rock into the future for everybody. U2! Yay! No. I was the world's biggest fan of U2, who's also like a singer-songwriter. I don't think any singer-songwriter on the planet has been more inspired by U2 to be an artist. And now I can't listen to their music anymore except one song, Window in the Sky, and maybe the song Heartland, because they're just about something that they truly love, and there is some love in U2, and it's basically love for rock and roll. That's the only love that I can actually find, because I know they don't love God. They love Satan. They sold out so bad, so hard, and they are like the way the Democratic Party is the bait and switch for all the bleeding hearts in politics. U2 was the bait and switch for all the bleeding hearts in rock music. All the Up With people, all the universal love messaging from the Beatles was supposed to be transmitted into U2. All the universal love messaging of Bob Marley was supposed to be carried forward by U2, in my mind. And I think that's how they were positioned. Who else was it going to be? There was no other inspirational, aspirational, great rock band. They took out Pink Floyd. Why can't David Gilmour and Roger Waters get along when they're the greatest artists since the Beatles? Pink Floyd is the greatest music ever made. Ever, 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 ever. There is nothing in art, nothing in music, nothing in classical that is greater than Pink Floyd. And they make the biggest truth-telling, some of the biggest truth-telling in the movie, in The Wall, in Wish You Were Here, in Animals. Oh my God. And Dark Side of the Moon. They are truth-telling and going deep into the human condition with heart, sincerity, and gravitas. And you gotta separate the star from the band. Roger Waters just can't get along with David Gilmour. We don't know why. It's just an ego problem. Maybe Roger Waters doesn't want to eat babies. I don't know. I'd like to know what Roger Waters knows about satanic pedophiles. What do you know about Roger? What do you know, Roger? Come on, Roger. What do you know about that? So they had to take out Pink Floyd, the greatest leaders in art, and give us U2 instead. And then Coldplay, and then a series of more degraded bands like The Killers. As I said, it just this degradation from U2, Coldplay, The Killers, and then God knows what, Imagine Dragons. It's just like the most hideous. Muse. Again, these guys are the manly men of musicianship, but they're the worst little ass kissers of Satan you have ever seen, other than Jared Leto in 30 Seconds to Mars. I mean, the degradation of aspirational, big-sounding, heroic, triumphalist rock music, whether it was the band Live, 30 Seconds to Mars, Coldplay, U2, they sold out the people because the cabal recognizes the power of this sort of like anthemic, triumphalist, epic-sounding rock like Pink Floyd and U2. It's like you could really get the masses by the short hairs of that kind of sound. And so they really had to rape and satanize satanic Coldplay, satanic U2, satanic Muse, and Live. That guy Ed Kowalczyk who says, after having met Adi Da in person, reverts back to being a Christian and is now still playing live, oh God, in the Illuminati-infested music industry. Ed Kowalczyk, what do you know about satanic pedophilia? Satanic ritual abuse and mind control. Ed, what do you know? Ed? So now it's the most disgusting, vile thing. The last truth in rock was Kurt Cobain, of course. And I believe he was assassinated, not just for Illuminati blood sacrifice, because he is unacceptable in terms of how truth-telling he is. God bless you, Kurt Cobain. I love Kurt Cobain. It was personally devastating for me when D. Boon died in 1984 and Kurt Cobain died in 1994. Both times it was like 3 days of stomach pain, of like heart just feeling aggrieved, more than aggrieved, like some wind had been taken out of our sails as a civilization, as a culture, as a society.